Hey everyone, welcome to another video, and today I'm going to tell you how to pick a class in Dungeons & Dragons. These are the steps that I go through when I think about picking a class every single time I get to be a player, which honestly isn't very often. When I do, I love to use this method to help me figure out exactly what I'm going to play. Okay, one of the first things we are going to talk about when you go to pick a class for a new game of Dungeons & Dragons, or even if it's just a one-shot, is the theme. The theme could come down to just simply the campaign setting and what it's all about, whether or not the game is going to be serious or more fun, and also whether the focus of the campaign or the adventure is going to be combat based versus role playing based. Now, these aren't the only things to consider when coming up with what the theme might be for your character, but knowing these things in advance will definitely help you plot out something like whether or not you're going to play a paladin in a campaign where there's no gods, for example. Remember, consult your DM on what kind of campaign setting it is and how your character might fit into that campaign setting before you even pick a class. The theme you pick can also heavily influence what kind of character background you have, or vice versa. Your background might actually influence what kind of theme you have as well. Again, these are best tied to the campaign setting itself and whether or not it is more focused on combat, roleplay, or whether it is a very serious or fun, goofy kind of campaign. Okay, next, after the theme has been chosen, I really like to think about the race or the species of the class that I'm going to play. Sometimes these things can pair really well together, and other times they kind of have overlapping abilities, which means you're kind of missing out on something, which, you know, if your DM's nice enough, they'll let you kind of replace one ability for another, but it doesn't always work out that way. So some cool things to think about are the physiology of the character that you're going to play, whether or not you want to, you know, be sort of a binary gender, or whether or not you want to be a little bit more gender fluid, and then whether or not you're going to present yourself in a certain way. Are they stocky? Are they tall and lanky? Are they anywhere in between? All those things. Do they have, you know, some kind of, I don't want to sound ableist, but some kind of deformity or something like that that could play into how the character acts in certain situations, and then also could, you know, influence how the character plays itself. It can be really fun to explore these things that you don't often get a chance to, and really understand the nuances of how, you know, real life society works and how people feel when they have these kind of disadvantages or, you know, other means of acting throughout the world. Another big one when you're picking the race or the species is, does it really fit into the campaign? So again, this ties back to the theme, whether or not the campaign setting is serious, fun, combat, or roleplay heavy. Think about those things when you're picking your race as well, and then you'll be able to figure out exactly if they fit in or if they seem a bit out of place. That's not always a bad thing. Being out of place in a campaign sometimes can be really interesting for story reasons, and if your DM is willing to put that little bit of extra effort in to help your character out in those situations, it'll make it all the more fun. So I touched briefly on interesting abilities that you get from some species and races. These can be tied into a lot of different things to do with your character, especially when you pick something like Aasimar. Now you think about the Aasimar, it has like different traits that it gets for being, you know, necrotic or kind of protective or radiant or whatever they are now in the new player's handbook that's coming out fairly soon. But those change how your character might actually develop over the course of the campaign. Remember, you don't always have to pick all these things, especially if they're things that when you level up, you're getting to choose new abilities and new interesting ways of interacting with how your character's past might influence what they're about to do. But these racial abilities should be considered when you're picking your class because, like I said previously, they might overlap. And if they do overlap and DM's a bit stingy on it, it might feel bad that you don't really get something extra. Okay, next I want to talk about style. This is, you know, mostly physical, I suppose, in a sense, but it can also be kind of more represented in, are they loud and boisterous, their personality type. Those kinds of things can influence the style of character that you want to play. Whether or not you feel like you want to be the face of the party, or whether or not you want to be, you know, more reserved and shy and kind of held back, but you definitely have strong opinions about certain things. And also your physical representation of yourself. Are you going to be drab or stylish or sleek or kind of, you know, a little bit more muted, or are you going to be very colorful and boisterous? This kind of style that you have for your character might not seem that important when you're picking a class, but let me remind you that you can pick a fighter that could absolutely be a fashionista. You could pick a sorcerer that could absolutely be covered in mud the entire campaign. Not all charisma-based classes need to be boisterous, outlandish, and very outspoken. They can always be very reserved and more intimidating and deceptive. So think about the style of character that you'd like to play and then try and tie that in to what class you eventually pick. And don't forget, like I said, with the example of the sorcerer, you can be a little bit of a juxtaposition, I suppose. A little bit out of the ordinary. It's always fun. Okay, the next thing I like to think about when I'm thinking of picking a class for a new adventure is the group composition. Have other people in your party already decided what they want to play? That's a really big issue for me. I don't want to play the same class as somebody else. I never want to play the same class as somebody else. I never really want to play the same role as somebody else. I always pick something a little bit different and a little bit unique. And the reason for that is it really gives you a chance to shine in your own idea of what kind of character you'd like to portray. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be the same sort of role as somebody else, but I really do tend to look at the group as a whole, and if people have already picked certain classes that haven't played much D&D before comparatively to me, I've had a lot of chances to play a lot of different characters, so I'm okay with being the last to pick, essentially. I really look at what everyone else is doing and I decide on what classes I might narrow it down to a little bit from that option. Also, what does the group need in that composition, right? Do they already have other roles filled, which I'm going to talk about in a second? Or do you want to be complementary to maybe show a new player how to play a certain role? So let's talk about that now. So there are a few different roles in your sort of party makeup, and you can think of this in terms of like, you know, a massively multiplayer online RPG, aka World of Warcraft. Think of it in terms of like your tank, your healer, and your DPS type roles. So the tanks are generally like frontline, big AC, chunky boys, lots of health. You know, they can stand a few hits, they have some good abilities to lock down the enemies into close combat with them, or maybe not necessarily in close combat, but at least lock down the enemies in a certain area so that they can't attack the weaker members of the party. We can think of this role as sort of the tank role, I guess, in a sense. Does your party have one? And if not, are you willing to be the one that locks down that area for the rest of the party to maintain their spells, their concentration, their energy into dealing as much damage as possible and perhaps even healing the party should they get knocked over? And if they do, would you prefer to play a more utility role in the party? Druids, clerics, bards and wizards are really, really good at this sort of role. You've got a plethora of spells to choose from. Druid and cleric have the ability to just pick what ones they need every single day, which is really, really helpful in terms of utility. They also have access to, you know, the healing spells and all those other things as well. But in general, these four classes have the most utility out of everybody. Wizard has the access to the most spells. Admittedly, they have to prepare a lot more, but they can ritually cast a lot of them, which is really, really handy as well. Bard tends to get a little fewer, but Bard also has versatility of a lot of its other class abilities. So those four classes really come into the utility role, and if you'd like to play one, they're great for that. Oh, I didn't really mention before, but the frontline utility is probably like Cleric's a good one, I suppose. It can have a pretty high AC too, but it's generally Fighter, Barbarian, and Paladin that make up the front line fighter types. Does your party need a healer? So the reason I say this in jest a little bit, I suppose, is you don't really need a healer in Dungeons & Dragons. You basically need 1 or 2 spells, Healing Word, Cure Wounds, even a Paladin's Lay on Hands, something to give one hit point to someone. That's basically it. Hit points in general in Dungeons & Dragons don't particularly matter until you're at 0. And you only really need to heal somebody from 0 to 1 so they don't have to make any death saving throws. The only differences to this are when something is, you know, at the highest level of the game where they're starting to cast things like Disintegrate, where if they have a certain threshold of hit points that they go over, it might automatically kill somebody. But for the majority of the time, that's not going to happen and you're not really going to have to worry about it. So healer is not really that big of a role issue in Dungeons & Dragons. It is very handy and it can be very, helpful in certain situations, especially when you're exploring dungeons and traps and things are going off and they're dealing damage to you as well. So you could take maybe 1 or 2 healing spells, or you might have class abilities that can simply help with those situations as well. So look at the classes that can do a lot of healing, or at least have some kind of manifestation of healing. So you've got like Celestial Warlocks, you've got Divine Soul Sorcerers, although I'm mentioning subclasses now that I realize are probably not going to be in the 2024 Player's Handbook, but Clerics, Druids, and bards, rangers, they can all take healing spells from their spell list, as well as paladins. So think about those classes and look at those spells and decide how many of them you think might be necessary for you to take, and whether or not those classes not only cover the healer role, but might also cover the other roles of tank, so frontline, or utility as well. So you could actually kind of cover more than one role in one class with some of these situations. Or do you simply want to be a glass cannon? Now, glass cannons are amazingly fun to play. You just use your biggest spell possible, do as much damage as possible, focus on dealing damage, and focus on dealing either high output area of effect damage with things like Fireball, or very, very straightforward single target damage with things like Disintegrate. Trust me, both are fun, and you can get away with taking a variety because a lot of the other people in your party will also have a lot of damaging abilities, so you don't necessarily need to pick the one type of spell. You don't always have to focus on the one type of single target damaging spell or area of effect spell. I would actually suggest to take a variety of spells, not just with saving throws, but also with spell attacks, because that way, if you know it has a high dexterity and it can jump out of the way of fireballs really well, but it has a low AC because it's highly mobile, it doesn't really have necessarily the kind of thick hide that might be on a bigger creature, you can maybe switch up how you're attacking the enemy to be able to gain that little bit of advantage. Now, sorcerer, wizard, warlock, cleric in specific subclasses, they gain access to a lot of good damaging spells, and druid too, I suppose. And you can use these to your advantage and absolutely demolish some enemies. But you also have to think that most of the time the classes that get access to these spells do have a very low armor class, so you do have to be aware that you're probably going to draw the eye of the enemy when you hit them very hard, very fast. But then you have to leave that up to your frontline fighters and your utility tanks to kind of stop them from getting to you. So I did ramble on a little bit there, but the role is one of the most important things to think about when you're picking a class, because it really gives you sort of what kind of class you might want to choose from. Although there are a couple that can kind of fill all the roles depending on what subclass you choose as well. And speaking of spells and things, that immediately leads me into my next point about abilities and spells. But before we get into that, I just want to mention to you guys that I do have a Patreon. You can see it right behind me there. I've got some monthly maps out, some blog posts, a whole bunch of stuff up there. There are also links to the stuff I've done on the DMs Guild down below in the description. You can check those out. A few one-shots and some interesting stuff. Go have a look. Don't forget, like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you get a lot of use out of it. Alright, back to the video. So we're talking about spells and abilities that you might pick specifically because you think they're really, really cool, which means you kind of pick a whole class just because it has access to this one spell. So there are a few classes like that. I think Warlock, Sorcerer, and Paladin are probably the most specific ones when it comes to having access to very specific spells that no other classes get access to, although Artificer has a few of these as well. But I'm looking forward towards, you know, the 2024 Player's Handbook. There's no Artificer in there. There are other new spell lists, new spell slots. I have no idea. I haven't got the book yet. I have ordered the book. I did pre-order the book. I pre-ordered a digital copy, and you know, I just have to wait for it to be accessible, even though there's already thousands of people who've gone to Comic-Con and a bunch of other bigger creators than me that have access to it and are already mentioning all the different changes online. I don't have that kind of advantage, so I'm speculating here and thinking that yes, they did say that the spell lists have changed quite a fair bit and that they will be changing a lot of the spells too, but instinctually I think that paladins generally have access to very specific spells because paladins are half-caste, and same with rangers too, I suppose. They have access to very specific spells and very specific ones that are only accessible by those classes, which means that if you're looking for something really cool, look through the spell list. Look through the spell list, find some cool stuff, think to yourself, hey, I like the look of that spell, and I really have a whole idea for a character that's based entirely around them being able to cast that spell. Make sure, one, your campaign's going to go to that level and you get access to that spell. And if it's a lower level spell and you get access to it very quickly, then at least you'll have the chance to be able to base your whole character around that from the beginning. This is not just limited to spells, however, this could also be used for abilities. And look at your class abilities, look at the cool class abilities, look at the subclass abilities, especially the new ones. Now in the Player's Handbook and the new 2024 book, everyone's getting their subclasses at level 3 from now on, which is one thing that I definitely know because I said it. You're going to have to at least be level 3 before you get to pick your subclass. So look at the subclasses and then see how you feel about all of them. Design a character around an entire subclass, which is generally what people do anyway. Have a look at the slightly higher level stuff as well as some of the reworked stuff that they've done as well, and see if you can decide a cool idea for a character based on a certain class. Okay, and lastly, I touched on a little bit earlier about personality, but I want to talk about roleplay. Do you have a character idea in mind, but you don't have the class picked yet? That's what we're trying to determine today, right? So does your character roleplay? And I don't just mean, do they have a personality? I mean, are they going to really be roleplayed? If you're gonna really want to step into the shoes of your character and talk how they talk, walk how they walk, move how they move, and think how they think, you need to think about this before you pick your class. Your class is something that you get at the start of the campaign. There's a reason you gravitated towards this class, and there's a reason that your character fits into that class as well. Now, this doesn't mean you always have to be the stereotypical kind of character to fit that class. You could be very much sort of opposed to how you are. Biggest thing that I can think of right now that comes to mind is a barbarian that doesn't like raging, but they know it's necessary. You could think of something like that. Or a warlock who hates the fact that they have to make a pact with their patron, but they know the power that they need to succeed at what their goal is an unfortunate circumstance. These are kinds of characters that you can use to sort of role play in a sense of towards your class, and it can be really fun. It can be really fun to sort of be like, oh, I hate having to do this, but I'll do it anyway, kind of thing. Like those are, you know, a little bit angsty characters, but they're fun to play sometimes. So give it a try. Or you could always stick to the stereotypical righteous good paladin that just likes to stand up for the little guy and do everything to protect everybody. Those are fun too, and they can be really interesting and played in many different ways. I've played the same Leonin paladin 2 different ways. One where he was, you know, a very boisterous, loud and proud lion that would protect everybody in the party, and the other one where he was born a noble as his background, and he thought everybody was a little bit lesser than him, and he was a bit of a dick. So there are many different ways you can play the same race class combo, but have a different personality and role play it differently. Remember, you don't always have to take charisma as a dump stat if it's not one of your main stats of your characters. You can always put a decently high charisma in there so you do have a chance to use those persuasion and deception and intimidation tactics on a character, or on a class rather, that doesn't necessarily have that as one of their main stats. And one of the big things you got to think about with roleplay too is, does the campaign really call for it? If the campaign is a lot more combat focused and there's hardly any RP in there at all, then you don't necessarily need to build your character around being able to roleplay as that character. You can describe what they do, talk about how they stand, talk about the things they think about and how they feel in certain situations, but doesn't necessarily need to be voiced all the time. So roleplay is, you know, an integral part of creating a character. It's not necessarily an integral part of choosing a class, although it can very much help determine what kind of class you might play depending on the type of character and how you think they might roleplay. Alright guys, I've been Mitz, and that's the video for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you found a little bit of interesting information. Remember, if you did find any value, please hit that like and subscribe button. Thanks again everybody. See you in the next video. Peace.